Hey guys, this is James from TeaDB bringing you a non-tea drinking episode. So this is InBetweenIsode number 112 for myself. So this is going to be another concept thing. I've been drinking plenty of tea, as you can see in front of me, but this episode will actually be focused on the topic and the very confusing topic of Pu'er storage. So it's going to be sort of another just different format episode. So let me know how you like it again. Let me know if storage is a concept you would like me to continue to cover. It's a very confusing concept because a lot of the information that we're given will vary, will come from the East, where maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's not such a good idea. So going to be going over some of those common conceptions and different ways that people store tea. So this video kind of comes in conjunction with a series of articles I've been working on for TeaDB. I interviewed, surveyed a bunch of different people that had been storing tea in the West, specifically in pumidors, for anywhere from the last 4 or 5 years to 8 years. So I haven't found anyone that stored tea for a really, really long amount of time in the West, but so we kind of have to settle for people that have been at it for at least some significant amount of time. So I've been talking with those people, so check out those articles on TeaDB. A lot of the information comes from there. So if you're to look, and you'll see some of the advice you'll get on tea, a lot of vendors, especially those maybe from the Chinese speaking community, will simply say, store your tea, store your pu'er in a cool, dry, well-ventilated place. That seems like reasonable advice, probably, to anyone that's just starting out in pu'er, and simple enough. But what we have to keep in mind is that the conditions in a lot of places in Asia, especially where pu'er is centered, is very, very different from the conditions in much of the West, like California or Nevada or Seattle, where I'm at. So the conditions really do vary, and so I find that this is generally actually really bad advice for people in the West, and it's a really good way to ruin your pu'er and get it dried out. Now, this won't happen overnight or anything like that, so I don't want to be fear-mongering, but if you store your tea in Nevada, for instance, in a dry, well-ventilated place, in a couple of years your tea is going to taste different, and it's not going to taste better. It will taste potentially very dried out. And that's simply because the West is much drier place than somewhere where pu'er is traditionally stored, like Hong Kong, like Guangdong, like Taiwan. So places where pu'er has a richer history. If you've traveled to those places, you definitely know that they are consistently more hot and more humid than your average Western city, I guess. And there's some give or take there, because there are obviously some places in the West that are hot and humid, such as Florida, or some places in Europe as well. Another thing that I see spread around is if you are comfortable in the setting, then your tea will be fine. And personally, I don't like this. I find it to be very lazy logic. Your tea and you are different things, and therefore it's pretty easy for me to think that they will need different conditions in order to age. And of course, there's going to be a variety of ways that you'll be able to store tea, and it will be fine. But I think if you're living in Nevada and you have constant air conditioning and your tea is at like 10% relative humidity for a few years, I don't think your tea is going to age too well. You might be comfortable, but I don't think your tea will be very comfortable, just frankly speaking there. So I think that's a really lazy explanation for tea. That's my own personal opinion. So feel free to take that, any of this really, with a grain of salt. So those are two misconceptions, in my opinion, that we're starting out with. And so one of the things I've done lately is I've moved, so a lot of these things are fresh in my memory. I did a quick shot of the pumidor there before the episode, so you can see that it's very similar to my setup, just carried over to a different part of Seattle. And so, as you can see from my pumidor, it's a fridge. So a pumidor doesn't necessarily need to be a fridge. It could be a fridge, it could be a wine cooler, it could be some sort of plastic bin. There's a lot of different ways that they do it. And what are the main reasons for a pumidor? Let's see. So we are pumidor. Wow, I'm not spelling that right. Alright, so pumidor. And it's really simple. One thing that pretty much everyone agrees on is odors are bad. Don't store your tea next to your kimchi. That's just a terrible idea waiting to happen. So big odors odors are really easy for tea to absorb. So it's a really common sense thing that you don't want to have your teas absorb them. Having a pumidor or something like that helps to protect the tea against some of those more pungent aromas that might be in the air. So that's one reason for a pumidor. And probably the bigger reason is humidity control. As we covered earlier, a lot of the West is much drier than places where Pu'er is stored. Having and sort of creating this sort of like microclimate within your fridge or within your plastic bin is a way so that the humidity would be different within that container versus the whole living space. So for instance, I'm looking at the relative humidity now where I am sitting at, looking at a hygrometer, and it is about 47 RH. Fine for me. I don't think my Pu'er is going to age so quickly under those conditions, for instance. So it allows you to create a climate that is different from the outside world, where you have easier control of humidity. For most people in the West, that means that their tea will be stored in a bit more humidity than it would be outside of the pumidor. Alright, so simple enough. Those are the basic concepts. And so here are a couple dangers. And so these were really generated from speaking with a lot of people that have been storing teas in pumidors for a while. So some of the dangers of storing tea, really. So the most obvious one is too much humidity. And what happens when you do that? You get mold. Or too much humidity. So basically your tea has too much moisture in the air and it gets moldy. So it's a pretty simple concept. We're all aware of that. And that can definitely happen if you push your parameters too much. One way to combat that is airflow. Airflow helps to reduce the amount of humidity, but it could also potentially help to dry out your tea. So there are definitely trade-offs and drawbacks to everything. Some people like to open their pumidor for 10 to 15 minutes every week. Those parameters can vary very significantly. Now, the flip side of this, and this is what I think a lot of Western Pu'er people worry about, is too dry. And this can also permanently dry out or damage your tea. So that could mean that your tea ends up being like super sour. But if you've ever tasted some really dry stored teas that have been exposed to a lot of air, especially, I should add that as well, and or air, that can really mess up your tea. So even if you're not going to the step of having a pumidor, it's usually a good idea to at least do some sort of cardboard box or something that's relatively odorless that will help to prevent your tea from being exposed to too much airflow. Alright, so those are pretty obvious, and they're kind of two different sides of the same coin. A couple additional ones that I found were too cold, and this can also result in mold. So one important thing to look at is look up a dew point calculator on Google and start messing around with the parameters of temperature and humidity. So what you'll find is that 75 real humidity at 70 degrees is less likely to cause mold than 75 RH at 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're trying to replicate cave-like conditions or something like that for Pu'er, which basically just means colder and higher humidity, you are running a significant risk of mold. And I've ran into probably more instances of people who stored their tea cold getting mold than people that were storing it more consistently at a hotter temperature. So that was really interesting to me and not really something that I expected. So what can happen is that as the temperature cools down, so if this would especially be notable if you're trying to store your tea outside, is that it will cool down, and the moisture that's in the air, because cooler air holds less moisture, could be absorbed into the walls of the pumidor, and eventually the tea could absorb some of that. That's a pretty poorly worded explanation, and I don't understand the concept 100%, so maybe someone that is better at science can interject in the comments below and clarify it. But too cold is a big risk as well. All right, so final thing is seasonal shifts. So these can be similar concerns. As one reason would be the reason that I just stated. If your temperature goes from 80 degrees and 75 RH to 50 degrees and 75 RH, that's a really worrisome time. So I know that there is a lot of people in places in Asia, for instance, where there are seasonal shifts that really do worry about their Pu'er when it's transitioning, for instance, to a rainy season. So you have to be careful with these things. And in fact, one of the places that's really known, and a lot of people think it has really stellar storage, is Malaysia. And if you look at the temperature and humidity breakdowns by month in Malaysia, you'll see that there's very, very little seasonal shift. Whereas even places like Hong Kong and Taiwan definitely have distinctive seasons. So these seasonal shifts might be good times to allow your tea to get a little bit of airflow as just sort of a safety measure, especially if you're in an area that has sort of like significant changes. I've heard of people in Thailand sealing up their Pu'er while it transitions to these rainy seasons. And one other thing that might be more applicable to Western Pu'er people is that you can storing tea in a fridge or a wine cooler, for instance, versus a plastic bin. One advantage that the former has is that it will help to insulate your tea a little bit more versus potential shifts. So the temperature might shift really significantly, but because you're storing it in something that protects it a little bit better, it will be slower to shift and be a little bit gentler on your tea. Again, a good way to combat these, and if you're ever worried about getting pushing the parameters too much, is just to allow a little bit of airflow. Airflow is one of the most controversial parts of storing tea, and so you'll find people that believe it's 100% necessary and people that believe it's really not necessary at all. I tend to lie on the case that it's a nice safety measure occasionally, but it's not. It's one of the parameters that you shouldn't really worry about injecting too much in, especially if you're living in the West, in a Western climate where your humidity tends to be on the lower side of Pu'er storage. Alright, so I think that is all I wanted to go over. So thank you guys for tuning in. Let me know how you liked this storage lecture, I guess you would call, on Pu'er, that is. So thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you guys next time. Cheers.